You're on, Harry.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to presentation number 7, everybody. It's good to see so many people again. I've got great pleasure in introducing our 2 speakers today, our 2 workshop leaders. That's Professor Nigel King from the University of Huddersfield. He's a Professor of Applied Psychology and Dean of the Graduate School.
No longer.
Oh, no longer. Lucky you. Have you been given another role, or you don't want to say?
Not yet. I'm keeping quiet.
Okay, so Nigel did his PhD in organizational psychology, and he's been doing a lot of work on qualitative research. He's got so many publications and 3 books, I believe, Nigel, on qualitative research, and looking at many different areas such as primary care, infection, prevention. And a nice one for your grid today is the engaging with nature and the natural environment, very topical. And I'd like to introduce Professor Viv Burr, also of the University of Huddersfield. Viv is Professor of, in the Department of Psychology and Professor of Critical Psychology, and well known particularly for the 3 editions now, I think, of the book Introduction to Social Constructionism, which has got a very good name, and also the very nice Invitation to Personal Construct Psychology, which he wrote with the late Trevor Butts. Viv and Trev did a lot of work together before his sad early death in 2015. Viv has done a lot of work on a lot of different areas. A nice one was Construing in the Arts, which is an edition of the Journal of Constructivist Psychology. And Viv has also written on singing and life drawing, and it's been a great pleasure. I think it was probably Dublin conference last time, was it, that we had your beautiful soprano singing voice, whilst I accompanied rather badly on the clarinet with Devorah Kalekin-Fishman on piano. So
I do remember.
Yeah. So Viv's looked particularly at gender, and one that's memorable to me is workshops on looking at women's identity in terms of the shoes that they choose to wear. And she's worked on sport and aging and lots of different things. So let's get on and hear Viv and Nigel in their workshop on interpretive clustering, a qualitative approach to analysing repertory grids. Thanks very much, both of you.
Thank you, Harry, for that lovely introduction. First of all, I'd just like to say to everybody who very kindly and generously filled in and sent their grids to us, how much we appreciate that. And we've, of course, relied heavily on that material for the workshop today. So thank you all very much for doing that. I'm just going to very briefly tell you what we're going to do today. First of all, after this introduction, Nigel's going to introduce the interpretive clustering method by demonstrating the software to you by using one of the grids that we've collected, and then to illustrate what you can do with the software and what you can do with the outputs, what you can look for by comparing 3 of the grids that we collected. After that, we're going to have a very short comfort break, about 5 minutes. And then we're going to have move into breakout rooms, and we'll then go through another couple of examples where you can have a look at them yourselves and comment upon what you think is going on in the clusters that have been identified by the software that we've used. And then we'll then have about half an hour for discussion and question and answers. So I hope that sounds interesting to you. So just very briefly then to say how this came about. It started several years ago when I'd agreed to write a chapter for the Sage Encyclopedia on social research methods about the qualitative analysis of grids, about which I knew nothing. So it was very very rash really to have agreed to do that. And then having said that, realized that there wasn't much out there about how you actually do analyze qualitative repertory grids qualitatively. It seemed to be mostly about a content analysis of the constructs themselves. And at the time, Nigel and I were doing this research that Harry's mentioned about using grids to look at how people draw meaning from outdoor spaces, natural spaces, urban spaces, and so on, of all kinds. So we already had some material there. So we started looking at this and looking at how we might think about qualitatively analysing this material. And at that point, Nigel became the co-author on the book chapter that we did eventually write together. And we started looking at, you know, if you look at one construct and see how it might be related to another in a grid by looking at the patterns of ticks and crosses, if you're using, you know, just a simple noughts and crosses way of completing the grid, could you visually look at, you know, how the constructs sort of cluster together and how you might derive constellations of meaning for participants? Well, we played around with that for a long, long time. And the processes that we got into became more and more complicated until it felt like we were actually trying to reinvent some very complicated statistical method. But at that point, very happily, Devi Jankovic put us in touch with Mark Heckman at Bremen in Germany. And as it happened, he was already working on some software that was doing exactly what we wanted to do. So Mark just then, you know, took up the reins and finished developing this software, which is what we're going to be looking at today. I think that's about it, Nigel. Have you got anything else to add to that?
No, I think
Does that sound okay? So, you know, after about 2 or 3 years of struggle, you know, when we were about to give up and thinking we were on a highway to nothing here, Mark kind of leapt in and saved the day. So I'm going to hand on to Nigel now to begin to demonstrate this software and show what you can do with it and what you can get out of it.
Okay, thank you. There's going to be a little bit of me clicking about to get it up and working. Okay. Talk amongst yourselves. Right. Here we go. So, can you all see something? Anything?
Yes.
The words interpretive clustering and a nice red bar that says openwetgrid.ic. So this is the software that Mark has developed for us as a way to work out the matches between dichotomously coded constructs on a grid in order to look at how they cluster together in various ways. So when you open it, this is the home page that you get to, and there's a little bit of a blurb about what it's all about, and then there's actually a cluster there, but I'll show you some more in a moment. Then there's a tab with the method, which talks you through all the steps, and this is where you could if Viv and I want to elicit your sympathy, read through this and imagine us doing this by hand, because that's what we did. And when you read through, you probably think we need locking up somewhere. But the bit we really need is this the third of the links on the left, which is the analysis bit. And the way it works is that you have to put your grid into an Excel sheet, okay, in a very particular format. Now, on the basis of demonstrating the truism, do what I say and not what I do, the grids we gave to you to kindly fill in advance were not set up in the right way. So we doubled our work. So don't do what we do if you're going to do this. Look at the format that Mark's software works in and use that to collect the data from the start, and then you can just cut and paste into Excel and not have to reverse everything. But as you'll see, he has like conventional looking grid set up with the elements there in the columns, and you don't have to put preferred on one side and non-preferred on another, because the final column tells you whether the left or the right is preferred. So the left column is given a 0 and the right is given a 1. Okay, and it's really important you fill it in line with the Excel requirements that it shows here, because if you don't, it won't work. And we had one where there was a tiny stray character somewhere in the Excel sheet, and we could not get it to work till Mark managed to find this wretched thing and exterminate it, and then it worked.
So I think Mark has since fixed that glitch, so that if there is a problem with the Excel file, I think it tells you. Yeah, yes, that's right. So most things that were going wrong, a message that's fairly straightforward will come through, but it is important to get it into the right format. You've got your grid ready. Can you all see the box now? I'm dragging it over so it says upload. Can you all see that? Mm-hmm. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that. And you'll see a little button that says browse to go and choose your Excel file. So I'm going to pick one I prepared earlier. And this was actually, it doesn't really matter which of these I look at, but yeah, so I'm going to pick Bob Green's one here. Okay, and I'm going to click on that. So it's uploaded, and we can see it's uploaded okay. The grid has now appeared on the left-hand side of the screen. And it's told us that he's got 7 elements, 14 constructs, and there's 2 missings. You can just leave it blank. You put NA for not applicable for ones where it's beyond the range of the construct, or the person simply can't decide between poles, but it will just treat it as missing like it does here. You can see. So then you come down to this little set of options, and these are really important. And I think these are, it's really work well, because it lets you explore lots of different ways of thinking about and looking at your data. So first thing is, you've got to decide how many matches across the elements that you've got do you have to have for constructs to be considered to be clustered together. Okay, now we have 7 elements, and we've decided in this case that if it matches on 6 of those, we're going to call it a match, and it might become part of a cluster. But we can change that. We could decide, no, we want them all to match, or we could say only 5 of them to match. And it also counts exact opposite matches. So if something is, if on 6 out of 7 the exact opposite is scored, then there's clearly a relationship, though it's a negative one. So I'll put it back to 6 there. But you can also decide what size your cluster has to be. Now these, you'll see throughout this, are called cliques, and this is the technical term in graph theory. He says as if he knows what he's talking about. That describes this kind of relationship. Okay, but we'll probably call them clusters most of the time, because it's the kind of language that we're used to. So again, we might decide we're only interested in this particular study in where there's quite a big groups of clusters of constructs that cluster together. So we might say we want 4 or 5, or we might be interested in even a pair as a cluster. Okay, so for reasoning that I haven't the time to go into, we felt 3 was an appropriate number here. But as I say, you can change that, and of course it may be in a particular study you want to use different settings for different grids because of the nature of those grids. So for example, if someone's got lots of missings, lots of not applicables, they may not be able to get 6 matches because there's so many, because the not applicables don't count as matches. So you might have different settings for different grids that you're looking at.
Okay, last little bit before I show you some actual output. You'll see there's 4 choices here. So as you'll see in a moment, the default is that there are lines drawing showing whether there's a positive or a negative relationship between constructs in a cluster. Okay, but you can remove those. You'll see why you might want to remove them in one of the grids and diagrams I'm going to show you. And you can remove the plus or the minus and just have the lines. The default is that you indicate the relation by color. So the boundaries of the clusters or cliques are in different colors. Absolutely do that. And I'm quite colorblind, but it still helps me a lot.
I think that's the last one, Nigel. I think the one you're pointing to is that the plus or minus is in color. It's in red or green.
Oh, right. Sorry, the last one. Yeah. So the colorizing clusters. But I think normally I would tick all of these. And only if I had one that was really hard to read because of the sheer complexity of it, I might untick those top 2. Okay, so when you've got that all set like you want, you click this little box that says process data, and it goes and tells you, if you're lucky, your calculation is successful, and you click on the OK. But the result doesn't pop up here. It downloads it as an Excel file, and you have to tell it to download. You have to click on this here, and then it will download as an Excel file. So woof, there it goes. And that's the job. So actually, once you've got your grids into the right format, it's really quick, and you can play around with how you want the clusters to be shown. You can play around with how you want to define the clusters without it taking a lot of time. So I think we found that really helpful. So I'm going to stop sharing this now because I'm going to show you some of the outputs. Anyone got any pressing questions on any of that? Nope. Okay, so just give me a moment to get rid of that and get ready some things that I'm going to want to show and get my list of what I'm going to show. Okay, so I haven't got a terribly big screen, which is a pain for things like this, because we need one of these vast screens where you can move stuff around and this. So this is why I'm faffing about. Okay, where have we got that green? That's the right one. Right, I think that's right. Okie doke. So I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully all will be well. Okay, so is that visible? Yeah. So there we have, so this is what you get as an output from it. So you get this Excel workbook. There's the grid. There's all the stuff about the method again and the calculations. You don't need to look at that normally, unless something looked wildly wrong and you might want to diagnose what's gone wrong, but we've not found the need to do it. So it's this last one, this clique tab that you want to go to. So it tells you at the top here how you've set it, and then you'll see a list of all the clusters that have been found meeting your criteria. So remember, there's got to be 6 matches, and there's got to be at least 3 constructs matching to call it a cluster, okay, or a clique. So we see here that in Bob's grid, there are 4 clusters listed, and then you get to the diagrams. So there's various ways of showing these diagrams that it gives you. I'm going to, so is that reasonably clear? Oh, it's doing bouncing about like a down. across there. Can you see that on the left reasonably clearly?
Mm. Mm.
Quite
Yes.
hard to read
Yep.
the construct labels. Could you read the labels out, Nigel?
Yeah,
Would that be-
yeah. So just glancing at that, what you can see is there's the 4 clusters that we've got here, and you've got a little group of 4 constructs that all match together here, and they're not linked to anything else. They're quite independent. Then we've got actually 2 very, very largely overlapping clusters here. So the 3 in the middle in both. One of them has this one, which is somewhere I don't want to go, somewhere I'd like to be. And one of them doesn't include that, but includes trees and no trees. Then you've got a 4th cluster, which has a little bit of overlap. The trees, no trees, overlapping with some of these ones about work, about cultivation, about grind versus adventure. But it also matches independently with these 2, which are no waves and waves, can't see the ocean, can see the ocean. So that's, and then you've got elsewhere, you've got these other 3 constructs that don't cluster according to our rules, although it's showing that these 2 do actually match with each other, because there isn't a 3rd one in there. So that doesn't count as a cluster by the rules we're using for this particular analysis. So I won't spend a lot of time looking at the detail of this, because I'll come on and look at some more in a bit more detail. But I don't know if I can get it to zoom a bit, and if that will make it more legible. Is that a bit better for reading?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just show you what else you could. It also shows it with just the ones that cluster, taking out the non-clustered ones. It also shows it without the labels and just with cluster numbers, which is obviously neater.
Construct numbers.
Construct numbers, yeah. Which is neater but less informative, and the same without that. So you can choose which way you want to look at it. But I generally find this is best. Whoop. So just looking at that, you know, this one that is quite is not strongly related to everything else, is all about kind of urban versus not urban, population, populated, less populated, urban, non-urban, developed, natural, cars and neon lights against nature. So there does seem to be a very, very clear kind of commonality there about these kind of quite, I would say, maybe quite descriptive things about an urban environment compared to a non-urban. Whereas this bigger cluster, these overlapping clusters here, on the left, so there's one here and one here. There's 2 different clusters if we ignore the bit on the right for the moment. These are much more about, on the whole, about what you do in these kind of environments. Somewhere you want to be, somewhere you don't want to be, work, fun, grind and adventure. But it does also include cultivated and wild, and trees and no trees. So there's some kind of descriptive things that seem to Bob to be quite strongly linked to these kind of more kind of personal meaning related things around how he sees himself, and what kind of opportunities these different spaces afford. And then this little group here seems to be all focused on specific features of natural environments. And 2 of them are about waves and oceans and one about trees, and they all link together. But the trees thing, it's the trees that matter in relation to this kind of stuff around work and adventure and whether you want to be there or not the ocean stuff. So we're just, I mean, obviously very quickly just looking at this, but the, you know, I think Viv and I found that having the diagrams, we could just look at the lists, but the diagrams, I think, are quite kind of inviting to sort of ask questions about the grid and say, well, I wonder what's going on there. Which elements might be the ones that are not overlapping, and why might that be? And to explore it as, so kind of using this as a way not to answer questions, I suppose, about the grid so much as to focus and refine the questions you want to ask when you're making sense of it. Okay, how am I doing for time?
We've got half an hour before the break.
Okay, that's pretty reasonable. Again, any points of clarity or any confusions I can try to unpick at this stage? What I'm going to do then is just going to show you a couple more outputs, just to highlight the sorts of things you might ask of the data displayed in this sort of way. So I'm going to have to reshare and get the right things up. Where's it gone? Here we go. Right, let's do this one. So this is Fortune's output. If you just give me a moment to, things keep popping up unasked for all over the place. Here we go. So, right. Again, is that clear for everyone? You can see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here we see, again, like Bob, Fortune has got 4 cliques or clusters. Okay.
Nigel, did you know Fortune is here?
Yes.
In your audience.
Hello, Fortune. Feel free to comment on anything about this as I go through it. Okay.
Can you unmute Fortune so you can?
Too kind.
You're welcome. So, though, what might also strike you straight away is these are much bigger clusters. So, what might that mean? Don't know yet. But let's look at the diagram. And this is where getting rid of the lines, so I haven't done it here, might be something you want to do. So we look at Fortune's clusters and everything overlaps. You know, in fact, seven of
Sorry.
her. No, it's good. It's good. I mean, we're rubbing our hands in glee when we got this one. 7 of Fortune's 15 constructs overlap. Are perfect matches with each other, and only 2 of them don't match at the 6th level. So everything is very interconnected in a much stronger way than on Bob's grid. Just to flag a few things then about that. Those interconnections tend to be around, and particularly the 7 that are perfectly matched, are around kind of spaces that are healthy, afford life enriching opportunities versus things that are destructive. And that matches pretty strongly between nature versus urban or man-made. So to a much more, there's a similar sort of pattern in Bob's the thing, but it's nothing like as strongly kind of interconnected and in that, all pointing in that one direction as we see with Fortune's ones. And the ones that kind of, the ones that don't quite make the 7 tend to be some of the elements that are what we might call managed nature. So when I looked at the I'm going to go right back up to the grid here. Sorry, it's not up there, is it? It's here. Okay. When we look at whether they're at the preferred or the non-preferred, mostly Fortune is very decisive. So most of them have 13 or 14 noughts or ones. So either they're preferred on nearly everything, which is nearly all the more natural things, or they're non-preferred on nearly everything, which is the quarry and the city. And the only one that's kind of balanced is the farmland. And that doesn't quite, that has a kind of, that shows in the clusters as well. So some of the ones that don't quite meet the cluster, it's because of the way the farmland has been coded.
Nigel?
Yeah.
Have you got the ability on this to cluster the elements as well?
We haven't set that up yet, but in fact, I was just, while I was looking at this today, I thought that might be the next thing to ask Mark to do, because I think it's pretty clear what's going on with that, just from looking at it from the construct point of view. But I expect it would be a pretty easy fix for him, software-wise, to just turn it on its side and, as it were, and do the clustering on the elements. So, so we haven't got that yet, but I think it's something we're going to want to ask Mark to do.
One of my students did something very similar to that. He counted the number of matches the way you're doing between elements and ideal elements that he'd provided. That could be a very exciting step for you when you're doing analyses about elements and counting matches with ideal.
Yeah. Okay. Anything you'd like to comment on, Fortune, in terms of, does it surprise you the way your clusters work out, what seems to be going on here?
First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to do this. I found it very moving. I'm interested in what you discover about the farm. I was actually born on a farm in Kansas. My grandmother owned a large farm. And so I wonder if that affected the way that I felt about farms more than I knew.
So that's sorry. I wonder if it's a slightly more nuanced sort of response, whereas there could be a kind of idealization going on of the wild nature, and the anti-idealization of the city and the quarry, and it's the farmyard is the in between that's a kind of more nuanced.
That could very well be from my childhood experience, where it was often my job to walk the cows out and walk the cows back. So I could definitely see that. I wanted to say that as I went through and looked at the pictures, I had many artistic responses. For example, the picture of Ireland reminded me very much of the movie The Quiet Man, which is an idealization, a romanticization of how people in Ireland traditionally lived on the land. And then I wanted to say the quarry reminded me, because of the angles and the machines, it reminded me very much of the Bruegel de la Grite, which is a hellscape. Yeah, or I think in English we call that Mad Meg.
You mentioned that, I think, in an email. It's really interesting. And I think it's interesting, bringing in these things like the aesthetics of the actual images. Although we found relatively few constructs are brought forward that are explicitly about those aesthetics. I think you had a beautiful versus hellscape, and that, in fact, it's right there in the middle there with lots of things. But they don't tend to dominate it, although we did have some people, didn't we, who had an arts background, who did focus a bit more on some of those things about the aesthetics, rather than so much imagining themselves in the landscape.
That's right. In the original research that we did when we were developing this method, the way it worked out, we did have several people who had some kind of creative background, who often made comments about the images as images, which was interesting, but quite different from, I think, what we might have got ordinarily.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Fortune, and I'm going to just stop this one. I'm going to look at one more. Am I doing okay for time?
Yeah, you're fine. We've got another about 20 minutes before we need to stop for a break.
Can I ask something very basic, please?
Yeah.
Since my language is not, my tongue language is not English, I didn't understand quite what is the click number. What do you mean by clicks number? The clusters. Is it different people's clusters, or the same people, or the same person, or I didn't understand it?
So that they're all of the analyses I'm showing. I'm sorry if it's confusing. Are they're all ideographic. So they're all just looking at one person's grid and the clusters or cliques, and they're synonymous here for the way we're talking about it, that are found within that grid.
I suppose what we should have explained at the outset is that this is an ideographic method. It is, I mean, there may be ways that you could devise for looking at commonalities between people in the way that their constructs cluster. But for the moment, what we're viewing it as is an ideographic method where you're focusing upon the unique construing of an individual.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's maybe it's worth just saying, I mean, we published the paper on this method in a journal called Qualitative Research in Psychology, and I think we were very clear that we wanted to publish in a more general methods in psychology journal to try and entice some people who are not constructivists to consider these sorts of methods, because we think, as I hope everyone here thinks, that they have value beyond the sadly fairly small group of us for whom this is, you know, our main focus. So we're very much wanted to make that. And I think one of the key points we wanted to make is the difference between thematic analysis, where people are saying this thing is, and it's the researcher saying it, this thing is rather like this thing. And that's what most qualitative analysis of grids actually that we came across was doing. It was actually content analysis of constructs across grids. It's not doing anything about what's going on within the grid. And we wanted to make clear the important distinction with what's going on here, which is looking at the way one construct has implications for other constructs. So that if you tend to think and make sense of the world in this way, you also tend to make sense of the world in that way. And that just doesn't get picked up in kind of standard thematic based analyses within psychology or other disciplines. So that was some of our motives for why we were doing it in a certain way and publishing in a certain place. So I'm going to just share one more, which is Francesca's. And I think I saw Francesca, you were here.
Just before you do, Nigel, there's a comment or a question in the chat space from Mike. I don't know if you're able to address that now, or just maybe we can talk about it later.
Mike, can you clarify?
Sure. One moment, please.
Yeah, I've seen the question now.
Yes, I think in that in the Green's representation, you had these clusters of differentiated clusters and differentiated constructs that seemed to have their origin in, if you will, mismatches.
Yeah.
That the mismatches between the constructs could be seen as instance of differentiation. And then in the second one that you provided with Fortune, that you talked about there being a lot of matches. And from one point of view, you could see that as lack of differentiation. On the other point of view, it could be that that's more integration. And I'm wondering about how do we think about both, I guess, conceptually and empirically in using this method, that issue. How do we know, how can we gauge whether we have lack of differentiation or increased integration?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I guess, I mean, my very unthought through immediate response, there's probably a limited amount of ways you can make that distinction just from this method of handling the data and presenting it. Although I think there are things. So I mean, I was looking at Fortune's grid, and where you've got that, you know, lots and lots of 6 matches and 7 matches as well. It's interesting to look at those ones that didn't quite match. You know, so what's going on where she matched 6 with, but not 7, and actually there were some clear patterns in that as well, which suggested that it wasn't just kind of idiosyncratic features of the particular image we'd chosen, but so for example, there was definitely this thing around the more managed nature things were more likely to slightly jump out of the standard pattern of nature good, man-made bad, which suggests actually, as you say, not a lack of differentiation, but actually quite a nuanced but integrated way of construing. So I think you know, looking at the detail and what doesn't quite match and what's going on, you know, what's going on with there. What are the odd ones that don't cluster at all? You know, can get a bit of a sense of that as well. And I guess you know, in an ideal world, you know, I would like to, if I'm using this in research, you know, I'd like to have a two-stage process where, you know, I did the initial grid interview, bunged it through Open Grid, and went back to the participant with what we've shown here, and then use that as a stimulus for further discussion. And then I think that would be really very fruitful. But thanks, Mark. That's a really interesting point.
Would it be fair to say? Go ahead, Debbie. Sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering, Nigel, how sensitive the method is to the number of not applicables.
Yeah.
Like an idiot, I didn't read the instructions properly initially, and I did my standard 5-point rating scale grid. And then I did what I was supposed to do and, you know, read the instructions and turned the ratings into ones and zeros. And I found myself coming up with an awful lot of non-applicables.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering to what extent a grid isn't really usable because there's too many.
Yeah, I think that is an issue. And actually, we've had a few with quite a lot. And of course, if you're saying there have to be 6 matches, but the presence of a not applicable means it's void, you may just not be able to match that construct. I think, I mean, funnily enough, I've been doing, I'm doing some stuff with similar images with some second-year undergraduates at the moment who are totally new to it, and we got them to do simple grids. And there was one of the 3 who had a lot of not applicables, and she was saying, well, shouldn't you set the border lower for that? I thought, yeah, that's what you should do. There should be a way to say, if there are not applicables, then you reduce the number you need to count it as a match.
The reason I'm mentioning it is that a lot of our discussion now has been about not being able to decide, or not being sure which is the preferred or non-preferred end. And the thought about, well, really, you should have a preferred end of a construct. Trouble is, a lot of the constructs I work with don't have a preference, and the obvious rating on a 5-point scale is going to be a 3, carrying meaning rather than indicating a blank. You know, if I'm interviewing people about their bosses, I might get a construct: technically skilled, socially skilled. And you know, the preferred point is, well, look, chaps, I want my boss to be a bit of both.
I don't think the idea of having a preferred pole, I think, is a nicety. It's not necessary, because I mean, the program will identify which poles of each construct are related, but if you do have preferred poles, it can add other interesting things which we have found in some grids, whereby preferred poles of one construct are strongly related to non-preferred poles of other constructs. So that is an interesting finding, but of course we don't necessarily need to have preferred poles for every construct, as you say, and sometimes we just can't supply them.
Well, that's comforting, because I noticed at one point you said you did check for reversals, and that would be a way of handling a situation where you're not requiring preference, but still being able to say something about the relationship between two.
I just see Mark's joined us, so hi,
yes,
Mark.
He has. Hi, Mark.
And I think I'm pretty sure that if you start out by saying people should use a dichotomous tick cross, or a 0 if they really can't use the construct, you end up with fewer zeros than you would end up with 3s on a 5-point scale. My gut tells me that, but it would be an interesting thing to try out. But I better move on, because I did want to have a quick look at Francesca's grid, and I think Francesca is here.
Hello.
Hi, Francesca. Hi.
So can we see this okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So straight away, here's the listing. You see Francesca just has two clusters, one of 3, one of 4. And when we look at the grid, it does, and the cluster or clique diagram, it is quite different from the others. So one of the things we might note straight away is that Francesca has many more proportionately constructs that don't cluster than the other two had. So both of the other two, although their clusters differed in how they're related to each other, with Fortune's being very overlapping and Bob's being much less so. In Francesca's case, she's got most of her constructs are not strongly related to other constructs. They're quite discrete. And then there's a little group of two, a typical kind of 2 overlapping clusters, which are orderly messy with full and roomy, predictable, unpredictable, and then full roomy, predictable, unpredictable, also with agitation, serenity, hard and soft. So there seems to be a group of things around a preferred pole towards things that are not so controlled, not so predictable, and that's associated with spaciousness and serenity and softness, as opposed to something that's hard, full, agitated. But that doesn't necessarily link, for example, here to artificial versus natural. Whereas I think if you looked at constructs like that for Bob and Fortune, they tend to be bang there in the middle of the overlapping clusters, but they're not particularly for Francesca. So it feels like your construing is quite discriminated here, but amongst these different things, in a rather different way from the other two. So is there anything that strikes you about the way this has panned out?
I'm very surprised. I was very curious about what was the result. And but I was thinking about my my need of predictable things in my environment. But now you surprised me, because you're saying the opposite of what I was expecting.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting to note that, really, isn't it? That so do you? I think you had the unpredictable and the messy and so on as your preferred choice, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. So predictability seems to imply these things that are agitating and hard for you, but they're not necessarily linked to the artificial and the natural, or to say adventurous and romantic, or routine versus holiday. So it seems like you're making those judgments almost on a much more kind of one-by-one basis. What does this particular place suggest to me? Whereas I think Fortune, if you take is the opposite of yours, is you know, if it's not touched by human hand too much, then pretty much all the good things apply to it.
Yeah. So let me understand better. In my case, like if we compare it with Fortune grid, there's no like the natural constructs is not so important to my.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that consistently you tend, but most of the more natural looking images up at the preferred pole, and the more urban and human influence at the non-preferred pole. There's more variation in the way you do that.
Yeah, and What's your interpretation of this variation?
I think that's quite hard without talking to you and coming back to you to ask what's happening here. But it seems to me on the face of it that you're construing around outdoor spaces is not first and foremost that kind of natural or artificial category as the first, whereas perhaps in Fortune and Bob's cases, that seems to be kind of dominating the story, particularly in Fortune's one. So you may be looking for things you value, like messiness over orderliness, might be there in a natural space, but it might be there in a man-made human space as well.
I think Devi maybe put his finger on it in the chat comments that I used to call these single constructs on a cluster diagram isolates, but I don't think we should be saying that they're sort of less important. They can be very important.
Yeah.
And it's a picture of as Devi just said, a cognitively complex. In other words, it's a rich construing in which a lot of different dimensions are being used.
That's right, yeah. It's not all mopped up by one or two monolithic constructs or monolithic components, rather. Yeah.
Guillaume just added a comment saying about potential dilemmas and contradictions in the. Is there evidence that there might be that there, Guillaume? Can you put your mic on a minute?
Sorry, I cannot follow thoroughly all the presentation, but I heard about this. I think it was Viv who said that sometimes preferred pole was linked to a non-preferred pole, and I think that would be an easy way to understand an implicative dilemma, because something which is preferred from one point of view is not so from another point of view.
Yeah,
that's right. I was just put in the chat space, Guillaume, that in our previous research data that we developed this method from, we found instances of that, particularly where a participant prefers, say, safety versus danger, and also prefers adventure versus mundane or something like that, but where safety and adventure are are in tension with each other, that they they're in a negative relationship. So preferring both adventure and safety, but adventure implies danger for the person, which is not preferred.
Yeah, and actually I think I'm right in saying Francesca's got two here that are negatively related. You look on the diagram, you see those two connections are in red with a negative on. So full and roomy, though she tends to prefer roomy and tends to prefer unpredictable, roomy is relating to predictable, unpredictable is relating to full, and the same with hard and soft and predictable, unpredictable. So there are possible dilemmas being shown up in that, and I don't think in either Bob or Fortune's cluster diagrams there were any negative relationships where preferred was relating to the non-preferred of another construct. So that's another kind of feature here that might be interesting to think about. But
is preference plotted? Sorry, is preference plotted in some way in the graphic?
Yes. So if you look at the little lines between constructs that are matching, so where there's 6 out of 7 on elements they're matching in the rating. If it's a plus, it means the preferred links to the preferred, and if it's a minus, it's the opposite.
But I think Guillaume was asking whether preference is indicated in the grid, in the display. I think the answer to that is that by and large, I think the preferred pole is on the right. But if there isn't a preference, it's just the left-hand pole that's. I think this is maybe another thing about the program we might want to ask to be changed, or we need to change it in the way that we lay out the grids, because the way we've asked you to do your grids was to put your preferred pole on the left, but actually the the software analyze it so that the preferred pole or the left-hand pole in each case is on the right-hand side. So the answer is broadly yes, but whatever's on the right-hand side may not be preferred if there isn't a preference in that construct. I don't know if that makes sense.
Would it solve the procedure by suggesting that the emergent pole should always go on the left? You know, the two that go together on the left, the implicit pole on the right. If, as you said, Viv, the software will sort out possible reversals and so on,
Yeah.
that wouldn't be an issue. And
yeah, I think we like to know the preferred pole if there is one, but I think I did suggest to people that if they didn't have a preferred pole, that they put the emergent pole on the left, so that I think that maybe I didn't do that, but I intended to.
One thing that Peter Honey does is to supply a construct which summarizes the overall view of the topic of the grid. Overall prefer, overall don't prefer, and ask the respondent to rate all of the elements on that. Then you can put that supplied construct into the analysis. That's going to sort out preferences and non-preferences, and indeed the extent of preference and non-preference.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just conscious we're just up to time when we said we would take a short comfort break.